As I mentioned before, this is not a course on Angular. However, there are some patterns and syntax idioms I want to introduce early before we get into the code. I like to think of them as Angularisms. Yes, I just made up that word. There are a few key concepts peculiar to Angular that I want to show you before we need to use them. One of the things about Angular is that it encourages a strict separation of concerns. Your HTML, styling, and executable code are kept separate from one another. These concerns can communicate with each other to share data and events through binding expressions. And two Angular directives, ngFor and ngIf, which enable you to render multiple copies of an element, or decide whether to render it at all. To work through the examples in this section, you might want to open a browser to stackblitz.com/fork/Angular. This will provide you with an immediate sandbox where you can follow along. Let's start by talking about Angular's concept of separation of concerns. In Angular, UI functionality is encapsulated in components. A component can represent anything from a piece of text, a button, a form, or even an entire page. Components can contain other components, and they can communicate with each other through very well-defined interfaces. To specify that a TypeScript class is a component, use the component decorator. That's the word component with that @ sign. Decorators provide additional information by annotating or modifying classes or class members. In this case, the component decorator specifies additional metadata to Angular about how the class will behave. The selector tells Angular to expose this component using the HTML tag myapp. Template URL indicates that the HTML markup can be found in the file specified. Likewise with the style URLs. Notice that this value is an array, which means you can provide more than one CSS file. The executable portion of the component code is found inside the class definition. This one contains a single line of code, meaning it isn't really doing much. But this is what we mean by separation of concerns. The code, the markup, and the styles are all separated from one another. Let's take a look at the markup. This is found in the template file. This file is pure HTML containing the visual content. The first line is a tag referencing a custom component named hello. You can see in the output that it displays the value of the name variable from the app component, which is the word Angular. The power of using components is that you can reuse them, extracting out the common elements and vary them based just on what changes. In this case, the name being passed in. Those curly braces are an example of an Angular binding expression. At render time, the value inside the curly braces is retrieved from the variable name inside the component class and passed into the hello component through its name attribute. Using the word name for both the variable and the attribute is unfortunate and may lead to a little unnecessary confusion. I can change the component variable to something else like person name, and that might make it less confusing. If I change it in the markup, I have to change it in the component. Return to the component code and change the name variable to person name, and then change its value from Angular to something else, and look at the result. Angular watches for changes to these variables and will re-render the component whenever these changes occur. To see an example of component reuse in action, simply make multiple copies of the hello tag. However, now we have a problem. We only have one variable called person name. We can hard code the other names. That will work, but it's not very useful. What if we had a bunch of names? Let's change the person name variable on the component and make it an array called people. We'll add a few people. The cool thing about reusing components this way is we don't have to change the hello component at all. We simply need to change the tag where we use it to include ngFor, an Angular directive used to create multiple instances of the hello component based on the number of elements in the reference array. You use an ngFor by providing it as an attribute to the element you want replicated. The value inside the quotes is the looping expression. It consists of the keyword let, followed by the variable name to be used inside of the element and any of its children, the keyword of, and the name of the array on the component to loop over. The asterisk, which is required, is an indication to Angular that this directive will manipulate the DOM, or the page's document object model, in some way. There is an alternative binding syntax that works with HTML attributes. If you want to set the value of an attribute to a value on your component instead of the curly braces, you can surround the attribute name with square brackets and provide the variable name in quotes. Here, the first instance of name in square brackets refers to the HTML attribute of the custom hello component. The second, the word person, in quotes, is the name of the variable in the ngFor expression. Personally, I prefer this method. I find it a little easier to read. The next type of binding I want to discuss is event binding. Any HTML event can become a trigger to execute a function on the component. The simplest way to illustrate that is to create a button and provide a click handler. Then inside the quotes, call the component function you want to execute. In this case, let's call toggle. Back inside the component, we need to implement the toggle function. Add an isToggled variable at the top of the app component and set its initial value to false. Create the toggle function, which will simply negate the value of whatever isToggled happens to be. Now when you click the toggle button, the value of the isToggled variable will flip between true and false. The isToggled variable is useless to us until we do something with it. Let's add a new paragraph tag inside the template file. In this case, we'll add an ngIf directive and set its value to isToggled. ngIf will conditionally render the HTML tag if the value inside the quotes evaluates to a truthy value. So as we toggle isToggled on and off, the paragraph tag will appear and disappear. Finally, let's open that hello component. It's pretty cool that we haven't had to do this up to this point. It's a great illustration of an alternative method of creating a component. The component decorator still defines a selector, which again is the name of the HTML tag. But instead of referring to the template and styles inside of external files, this component defines them directly in this file itself with the template and styles properties. I don't recommend this pattern except for the most trivial of components, as this is. Notice though that even in this example, there's still a general separation of concerns. The template, styles, and executable code are all in separate parts of the file. Well, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and build our first Ionic app.